1936. We review a year which will become one of the memorized dates of history. In our contemporary lives, it will be a remembered date for most of us for the poignancy of that royal drama with which it began and ended. King George V died in January, taking with him a people's love to his grave. That funeral procession, dignified by so much sorrow and emotion, will remain the transcending picture of 1936. Majesty is a great and simple thing. A king has passed. We have known a king. King George's character was of such simplicity and devotion to duty that it truly formed part of the background of our own daily lives. King George's death overshadowed other national bereavements. Rudyard Kipling, poet of empire, whose influence will long remain an inspiration to youth. Beatty, the sailor who so nearly won the Battle of Jutland for Britain. Allenby, the soldier who captured Jerusalem and fulfilled the Crusaders' dream. And among monarchs, King Fouad, whose death places Egypt under a regency during the minority of young King Farouk. Egypt and England signed a treaty at the Foreign Office which provides for the gradual withdrawal of British authority over the land of the Pharaohs, while retaining control of the Suez Canal. Not long afterwards, terrorism in Palestine caused the dispatch of large numbers of British troops to the Near East. And elsewhere in the empire, a new viceroy arrived in India, and Lord Linlithgow began the visits among the Indian states on which their participation in the new constitution will depend. War during 1935 had reared its ugly head in Abyssinia. This year, the Italian campaign was brought to triumph by Marshal Badoglio. Flushed with fascist victory, Mussolini announced the inauguration of a new Italian empire, and Victor Emmanuel became a king emperor. By contrast, the pathetic emperor of Ethiopia made a hurried flight from Addis Ababa and placed himself under the protection of the Union Jack, first in Palestine and later in London. He made desperate appeals to the League of Nations for military support of his cause, and in an unprecedented scene in the Assembly, bore in dignity a demonstration by Italian journalists. Events led almost inevitably to the long-expected association of Germany with Italy in international politics. Italy, of course, had been a party to the Locarno Treaty, which was violated by Germany's remilitarization of the Rhine. No counteraction to the march into Cologne in other cities was taken by Britain or France, and the outbreak of civil war in Spain drew Italy by common interest to Germany's side. Of this civil war, it is hard to speak without horror. Political passion, pressed with terrible ferocity, has overwhelmed an old and civilized nation. The rebels under General Franco, reinforced by Moorish levies, pushed across Spain to relieve the gallant defenders of the famous Alcazar in one of the most heroic sieges of modern times. Madrid, tenaciously held by government militiamen and their women, suffered all the terrors of modern war. The strain of guiding British policy through an anxious year has fallen immediately on Anthony Eden, youngest foreign secretary ever, but ultimately on Stanley Baldwin, who has written his name in history during this year, 1936. In the spring, the cabinet lost Mr. J.H. Thomas, resigning as the result of an inquiry into alleged budget leakages. In the other two great democracies, there have been major elections. France elected a government of the left under the socialist Monsieur Blum. The United States re-elected President Roosevelt with a terrific and record majority, which established him as a ruler of comparable authority to Mussolini or Hitler, and enabled him to stand forth as the champion of democracy against other forms of government. Every nation has been extending its armaments. Britain's new measures, presided over by Sir Thomas Inskip, have been rated as tardy and inadequate in some quarters, but at Hendon, new aeroplanes of breathtaking performance were on exhibition, and whispers of a new principle of construction giving amazing results gained considerable currency. The Navy, too, received new ships, not very substantial or numerous yet, but while in Portland Harbor the existing home fleet is assembled for a royal review, plans for the new battleships which will be laid down in 1937 on the lapse of the Washington and London agreements are pressed forward. The Army continues its mechanization. Tommy Atkins paid a visit to Palestine and came home again. He too will have a few more comrades someday if recruits will come forward. Although science has devised a new marvel called television, which radiates from massive aerials at the Alexander Palace, the most spectacular feats of pioneering are still associated with aviation. The Hindenburg follows the Graf Zeppelin in proving that lighter-than-air machines can sail the heavens on safe and regular schedule. America sends a China Clipper across the Pacific on mail and passenger service. And Imperial Airways dispatches Canopus off to the Mediterranean to fly on Empire Air routes. Individual exploits have been many. Tommy Rowe set the London Cape record, the new mark of 3 days, 17 hours and 28 minutes. Amy Mollison broke his record in May by 9 hours. Mrs. Beryl Markham flew off alone from Abingdon one day and landed in New Brunswick, the first east to west Atlantic crossing by a woman. Jim Mollison crossed the same ocean for the 4th time, alone on this occasion from New York to Croydon, making several new records. Charles Scott won the London-Johannesburg race, repeating his success at the Melbourne Airs. And finally, wonderful Jean Batten not only broke the solo record from London to Australia, but capped it by flying on over the Tasman Sea to New Zealand. While aerial travel grew safer, disaster took grievous toll on land and sea. Floods swept the eastern states of America. Dust blotted out cultivation in the Middle West. Hurricanes tore up townships in the south. And forest fires burnt out country villages. Off the coast of Devon, the sailing vessel Herzogin Cecily ran ashore in the most spectacular wreck of the year. Among Britain's fires, a fierce conflagration wiped out that monument of Victorian England, the Crystal Palace. It is a relief to turn to the lighter topic of sport, that Grand National in which the fancied Golden Miller fell at the first fence. Davy Jones ran out when leading at the last fence, and Reynoldstown won for the 2nd successive year. That boat race which Cambridge won for the 13th successive year, and that Derby, one of the most thrilling races of recent years, which the grey horse Mahmoud notched for the Aga Khan. Britain won the Davis Cup for the 4th successive year. Fred Perry, still Wimbledon champion, regained the American singles title and took to jumping nets again. And later he took another hurdle and leapt right over into professionalism. But the big sport of 1936 was, of course, the Olympiad, which opened with a runner dashing into the stadium and Hitler accepting a bouquet. For Britain, Whitlock won the walk. The British relay team was first in the mile. Beresford and Southwood rode away with the double sculls, otherwise British successes were painfully few. It was America who collected most of the honors, the chief contributor being that amazing Negro athlete, Jesse Owens, winner of the 100 meters, 200 meters and long jump. The most spectacular Empire success was Lovelock's triumph in the mile for New Zealand. One lost hour was recovered for Britain. The Queen Mary left Southampton on her maiden voyage in May and received a tremendous welcome in New York. Steaming well within herself for several months, she eventually broke the Atlantic time for the west-east run in September, with a record of 4 days, 27 minutes. It is sad to record the death of Sir Edgar Britton, who commanded her, but he lived to see his ship regain the blue ribbon for his country. At the home of the Duke and Duchess of Kent, where little Prince Edward attained the mature age of 1, there was cause for rejoicing. This charming picture of the Duke and Duchess and little Prince must be accounted among the most delightful of the year. But the year 1936 will be remembered not for its royal joys, but for its royal sufferings. The events of November and early December are too recent in our minds and too distressing to justify recapitulation here. Suffice it to recall that a reign, nobly begun, was cut short at King Edward's own will, and that George VI now reigns. We look forward in 1937 to the glories of coronation and the start of a new era of hope and endeavor.